The Wii is probably the most unique console we'll ever see, and even though it wasn't my favorite console that generation, I still feel like I'm going back to those games pretty often because there are a lot that I really love. Whether you want to admit it or not, the Wii Remote and Nunchuck allowed the Wii to have some incredibly creative games. Back in 2006, when everybody was busy playing Wii Sports and getting involved with motion controls, Ubisoft actually decided to come out with a more mature title. This was the somewhat notorious Red Steel, the first game on the Wii that took the idea of these controllers with motion inputs and constructed a game based on shooting in first person, as well as including one-on-one sword combat. And for one reason or another, I and some friends put an absurd amount of time into Red Steel. Despite it being pretty poorly received and an objectively buggy and unpolished experience, we had a lot of fun with it. I do have an older video about Red Steel 1, mostly focusing on the multiplayer. If you want to check that out, I'll leave it below. Red Steel probably should have faded into obscurity at that point, and become just another of those early launch titles that everyone moves on from. But in E3 2009, Ubisoft announced that there is a brand new sequel to Red Steel coming out that was powered by the then new Motion Plus adapters. Brought to you by Joel McHale, of course, because it was 2009.
It's the most fun you'll have with a sword this year.
But this new take looked really fresh. No longer was Red Steel a generic Yakuza story, and instead Red Steel 2 would take the game into a new direction with a brand new art style and combat system. When I did eventually get around to it though, maybe a few years later on, I found that it was absolutely fantastic. See, when it comes to video games, sequels can do so much. They can not only expand on previous stories, but also evolve gameplay because it gives developers a lot of time to evaluate what they did well in the previous game. So here, with Red Steel 2, I felt that Ubisoft finally managed to deliver on the promise set out by the first one. At the time, I felt like the jump from Red Steel 1 to 2 had to have been one of the greatest comebacks in gaming history. They took a buggy and generic game and managed to turn it into something that was wholly unique and actually managed to really flex the Wii Motion Plus. For me, there were basically only 3 games that used that adapter. There was Wii Sports Resort, Zelda Skyward Sword, and Red Steel 2. 2 of which being Nintendo games says a lot. Maybe there are a few others that I haven't really played or haven't heard of, but I'd say those 3 really represent what those adapters are capable of. 15 years later, the motion controller wave seems to have been more of a fad than a revolution, but I think that returning to this game might yield some interesting results. I've been meaning to come back to Red Steel 2 for some time, to really get a look and see if it's just as fun as I remembered. So I hope you'll come along as we take a look at Red Steel 2 to see how it holds up today.
Nice try, but this is you!
Considering the middling reviews of the first Red Steel, everything in Red Steel 2 had to be rebuilt from the ground up. It's likely running off of the same game engine, but I mean to say that it's just all been changed quite drastically. It's all very much more streamlined, with most of the features that aren't related to that single player story mode being removed or limited. It gives a sense that Red Steel 2 is a bit of a budget title, but on the other hand, it does keep things pretty lean and focused. Even the story feels a lot faster here without wanting to waste too much of your time. Starting a new game sets you right off in the outskirts of a city called Caldera, where you find yourself captured by some bikers and dragged through the sand. In very typical Western fashion, you play as an unnamed hero that's also the last Kusagari, a cowboy samurai who has his sacred katana stolen by a gang known as the Jackals. Sometime before the game started, he was cast away from the Kusagari clan, but now they've all been killed by the Jackals, and Caldera's been overrun. So one thing leads to another, and you borrow a weapon from a man named John to get your sword back. And that's really all you need to know to get started. Making my way through the single-player campaign, I thought I'd remembered a lot more about the game, but it turned out that most of what I recalled was just the first chapter. Red Steel 2 is a linear game where chapters are mostly broken up by explorable zones in every level. Each zone has its own unique theme with linear dungeons that often loop back to a new chapter or explorable area. The first chapter feels like it's almost a proof of concept, but it functions as a great little snapshot of the general gameplay. Here you meet most of the other characters like Judd, who lets you upgrade your guns, or Tomiko, who sets up with John to upgrade your weapons. Later, there's also a guy named Songun that upgrades your armor. From the safe houses, you can take on side quests as you go through each level, which often involve finding or destroying some list of objects to earn extra money, but you don't have to do any of these if you don't care. As far as I know, you actually don't get anything for doing any of the collectibles or quests in Red Steel 2 other than more money. There are these collectibles like sheriff stars and tokens, which you get by shooting specific areas or walking to hidden locations. You'll move between areas of the level, breaking down boxes and shooting chests, all for the goal of earning extra money and moving on to the next stage. I found it kind of funny that the second most common thing to do in Red Steel 2 is just mashing boxes open and shooting open chests. Eventually I realized that shooting was the most efficient way to break boxes because you would often just find bullets around for the revolver. It is fun to do for the first few minutes of the game, but eventually you realize how many boxes you're breaking, and it can be kind of tiring. The game actually involves a lot of breaking boxes.
So we really believe that hitting things is fun. That includes doors and, boxes, your friends, whoever you like.
Eventually, the game falls into this rhythm for the majority of the runtime. I think the highlight of the game is definitely the more contained dungeony areas, since they feel a lot more deliberately constructed. There were a lot of times in large areas where I wasn't exactly lost, but I would waste way more time than I needed to find some collectible I was searching for. The wanted posters in particular were the worst by far because they blended into the backgrounds and were just hard to keep track of. In one level, I was looking for almost half an hour and ended up finding the poster sitting directly in the shade outside of a safe house. It's kind of frustrating to have to do this stuff if you want to get all those upgrades, but it's not mandatory, so I find it hard to criticize too much.
Oh, we were right there, man!
The story in Red Steel 2 is delivered through a handful of animated cutscenes, radio voiceover, and an odd action set piece between major areas. The character animation and voice acting is serviceable, but nothing to write home about. However, I find the world design to be incredibly unique. Red Steel 1 visually didn't really have that much going for it, so in the sequel the artist made the right call and took a whole different direction. Environments and characters are all cel-shaded with scratchy outlines and flashy effects. That decision also allows the game to run at 60 frames per second on the Wii, and I think it looks great in motion. Red Steel 2 takes the Japanese inspiration from the first game and fuses it with the Wild West, allowing for some sci-fi elements in between. You'll find torii gates in deserted towns and Japanese advertising distressed by sand, and I think it works surprisingly well together. As a Wii game, it's only rendered in 480p, but the resolution still does justice to areas that are heavily stylized. The art style is definitely feeling a bit Borderlands-ish, but I can't think of anything that is specifically Wild West meets Japan like this. And while the aesthetic can be borderline stereotypical at times, I do think that it suits the concept of a gunslinging hybrid with a hack-and-slash game. They rationalize the Kusagari as being this specific clan of samurai that also work with guns, and it's a bit silly, but you get along with it. But truly, at the end of the day, everything in Red Steel 2's aesthetic and story is just meant to serve one thing, which is the fusion of FPS and hack-and-slash gameplay that sits at the core of Red Steel 2.
No one remains. You are the last of the Kusagari. I think you will be its hand. Yes. I think that.
Red Steel 2's combat is everything. When you aren't upgrading your equipment or speaking to NPCs, you're fighting enemies or walking to the next combat area to fight more enemies. Maybe the same could be said about any first-person shooter, but Red Steel 2's motion controls give it a uniqueness that, as far as I know, hasn't truly been replicated. Every attack is done with some combination of movements with the two main buttons on the Wii Remote. Swinging and thrusting the controller lets you do melee attacks with light and heavy variants, and pressing A will let you dodge and dash in different directions. Holding A lets you block bullets and slashes as well, and later parry attacks. Along with that, you can point at the screen and press B to fire a variety of guns, starting with your revolver that functions as your bread and butter range weapon, and later including a shotgun, machine gun, and rifle. After damaging an enemy enough though, they might get downed or stunned, and you can quickly finish them off with a swing or thrust motion. This might be the first game I played with first-person finishing moves, but it's something that would show up very often in shooters like BioShock Infinite or Doom 2016. With the addition of the motion controls though, finishing moves feel very gratifying, especially when you're dashing between enemies, taking them out one by one. The game is thankfully pretty forgiving when it comes to these inputs, and it allows it to be really fun and simple to tear through enemies right away. I also think it's really cool to note that the game heals you fully between any battle, and I think that's just such a great way to save time and really makes every fight feel like it's a challenge specifically based around beating this one battle. As you make progress, new moves will let you mix and match these inputs to perform a variety of special attacks. These take the form of dash attacks like the Matador, to charged launchers like the Eagle. Of course, many of these come with their own finishing blow versions too, which are all a lot of fun to splice into your gameplay. So soon enough, you'll manage to get a few upgrades unlocked, and you'll be tearing through loads of enemies in no time. These animations can be pretty brutal at times, but you can really tell that they had a lot of fun making them. There's a very visceral fun to swinging the Wii Remote and just hacking enemies to bits, finishing them off with a quick swipe. I think it's probably the aspect of Red Steel 2 that has aged the best.
Got my message, huh? You're the talk of the town, kid.
But playing the game today, I don't think I can say that it's really quite flawless in its execution. Something I noticed while playing through the levels is that a lot of these moves just aren't that important to use, which can be a good or a bad thing. It means that you don't have to be completely invested in the combat system to get through the story, but also it means that you might not engage with a lot of these fun mechanics. When enemies that block or have armor appear, you can often settle the encounter by just slashing as fast as possible, which can kind of trivialize the parts of your toolkit that break armor or stances. You can swing like crazy and just get through the game, but at least they do try to incentivize you to use these special moves. They do give you extra gold for pulling these moves off, so if you want to get all the upgrades, you'll eventually want to incorporate a lot of these things into your combat. And it's worth noting that using these special moves and finishers does make fighting a lot of enemies a little faster and safer. Plus, it's just more fun to play that way. "15 years or so removed from Red Steel 2, there have been a lot of games to come out since that have sort of improved on the ideas set out here. In hindsight, the game feels like a hybrid of the modern Doom games with the character action mechanics from Devil May Cry. So thinking about the combat now, I do wish that they had pushed further in that direction. The game's encounters are perfect for some sort of ranking system between battles, and I think that being praised for playing well would have not only helped explain things better to the player, but also gave the game more replayability. Without any sort of feedback on how well you played, fights can often just kinda end in unsatisfying ways. There is an unlockable challenge mode after you complete the game's chapters, but it pretty much has you just playing the whole thing again. It's very slapped together and definitely doesn't feel like a finished idea. Of course, Red Steel 2's reliance on motion inputs also leads it to run into the biggest problem with motion controls, which is the question of consistency. Sometimes the game just gets confused on what input you want, and the movement of swinging the Wii Remote can make it hard to realign and shoot as quickly as you'd like. Playing through the story, there were plenty of times when I would desperately be trying to input a certain motion and miss the timing because something was just out of sync. At one point, I think I adjusted my sensor bar in a bad way, and my reticle just flickered around the edges of the screen. Along with the lock-on system feeling a bit restrictive, it can make it hard to deal with enemies in the background. It's often easier to tank some stray hits and handle the closest enemies to you first, just because moving around and aiming at targets can be harder than it needs to be. I remember when Zelda Skyward Sword was releasing, there was a lot of criticism about that game's control scheme. I've come to realize that a lot of those issues that people were having were because they weren't creating a best use scenario for their motion controllers, but that isn't always the easiest thing to do. Similarly, with Red Steel 2, you have to make sure that you're a good distance from the TV, and you have to have your sensor bar in a good position, and you have to make sure that you have fresh batteries in your controller. If you don't do a lot of this stuff, you might be setting yourself up for failure. Regardless of the criticism, I think though that the combat here is really unique and fun in its own way. There just aren't any games that replicate the feeling of slashing through things in first person, and if they do, they can't capture the tangible feeling of the motion inputs. Eventually, I found myself swinging around, getting really involved with the gestures, because when the motions are working well, they just become second nature. It reminded me a lot of the exciting hands-on feeling that some of the best VR games have. The value of motion inputs isn't just that you can move the sword in funny ways, it's also to give you the immersive suspension of disbelief. Like, I know that I'm just swinging a plastic stick down, but when you involve the TV with the sound and the video, you do feel immersed in a certain way. Despite the flaws and troubleshooting with the old technology, the combat is still great. The game's got a pretty standard first-person shooter runtime of about 8 hours to do all the side quests and the main story, but like I said, I was pretty surprised how much of the game I'd forgotten over the years. I had sworn that at least a third of the game was set in the first location, but it's closer to an eighth. Chapter 1 ends with you retrieving the Sora katana from the jackals, but it leads to the hero searching for Shinjiro, the man that was truly responsible for killing the Kusagari. That means heading into the lower sections of Caldera, but eventually you'll be exploring the deserts around the city too. After the first battle with Shinjiro, you end up taking a train to follow them, and that's where the chapters start to have a lot more variety. Sometimes the explorable areas can be a bit overly simple and samey, but when the game takes the time to really flex its stylized environments, it can be really great to see. The section leading up to that train area was one of the highlights for sure. I love the neon signs alongside these decrepit desert buildings with that giant moon hanging overhead. And enjoying all those cool views meant I was often rewarded with those sheriff badges to earn some extra money. They also introduced these ninja enemies here, which were a lot more challenging and fun to play against. There are 3 main enemy types in Red Steel 2, being the jackals, the katakara, and the ninjas, each one having their own distinct abilities and progressively being more difficult than the previous one. I really did love that section of the game and the train segment following it. I mean, it wouldn't be the Wild West without a train, right? The train is honestly probably one of the highlights of the entire campaign, and it feels like a real test of your skills that you've gotten at this point.
This is your stuff.
You end up getting separated from the rest of the characters and dropped into this deserted town. This is about where I would guess most people would jump off of Red Steel 2 though, because it does really show how this gameplay loop is going to repeat itself. The next few areas are repetitive, with some more wanted posters, more enemies to fight, and more upgrades to buy. One funny thing I noticed is that you can upgrade your gun's damage by buying improved bullets, which I have to imagine is something I just never did before. They just look like decorations, and I don't think I ever clicked on them. But anyway, as solid as the Sandstorm Town and Canyon sections are, they did start to feel like more of the same. The plot continued moving, I'm sure, but I kinda just stopped paying attention at this point, because all it was about is following this Shinjiro guy. There's this regenerating samurai dude as well that makes for a pretty fun boss battle, and after a few more things, you're off to the end game. I'd say everything after that train section is somewhat forgettable, which kind of explains how I thought about these things before. There's a minecart section and cave area that was also just another area, but at least at this point you have all these combat moves, and it is a lot of fun to just fight enemies.
It really makes me wish that Red Steel 2 just had some sort of combat arena where you could play a survival match or something like that.
Something wrong, hero?
Finally though, it was time to raid this mountain temple where Shinjiro is waiting for you, and this part was a really great way to cap off the game. It's practically a solid half hour of back-to-back fighting on different varieties of enemies. All of the mini-bosses from each enemy type show up in different combinations, and I really got the feeling that you can make use of all the tools you've unlocked. I'm not sure why they give you all this money at this point, because you can't really spend it anywhere, but that isn't important. They really just throw everything they have, and I can't help but just appreciate how well the combat system works when you've gotten fully upgraded. I really hope it comes through on the footage, but this game really feels great to play in action. To the point that all of my criticism about the story or whatever else just sort of washes away when I get to have a great time just chopping through people. I mean, this is practically an excuse to show off footage that I like. When you reach the top of the mountain, you get one last great set piece with a few more fights before facing off against the last boss, Shinjiro. And it's a bit of a cakewalk. It's a cool setting with a cherry tree and red sun hanging overhead, but the entire thing was less than a minute. Maybe it's just because I upgraded the parry move a lot, or maybe it's because I did all those side quests and therefore was just overpowered in general. But all I know is it's definitely an anticlimactic ending. The last Kusagari gets his revenge and just leaves. No epilogue of any sort, no feedback from the other characters, but I suppose that's just what you do in a Western. Once the game's over, there isn't that much left to do. Somewhat annoyingly, the game doesn't have any easy way for you to return to previous levels to maybe upgrade the last few things, and a New Game Plus option I think would have went really far here. If I decide to come back to Red Steel 2 at some point, I'd probably play through again on the hard mode, because I think I'd like to grind out all those upgrades. I thought about going to do some of those challenge modes, but after realizing that it's just the story again, except you get a badge at the end, I didn't really see the reason to. As far as I know, there aren't any completion bonuses to speak of, but there were a few pre-order skins that you would get a code for if you bought the game at launch. There are a couple cool pistols that you can use instead of the revolver, as well as some sword reskins. It's actually an interesting way to implement these unlocks, where you just have an in-game code that you put into a menu. For something as simple as a reskin, I think this is a great implementation that avoids having to use download codes. But after everything was said and done, I still felt like Red Steel 2 is a concept that has a lot of potential. When the game first released, I don't think Ubisoft considered it a success, even though it did review quite well. But there's just so much room to expand on. The combat is a lot of fun, the world is very unique, and the story, well, could be improved in a sequel. I think the bottom line is that the motion controls and the whole idea of swinging around a controller just isn't that new or interesting to the general public. I had this feeling when I was playing the game that this could make for a really great VR sequel. But the problem is that the pace of the game might just lead it to being a headache simulator. So to answer the question at the top of the video, yeah, I do think Red Steel 2 holds up today, but there are some caveats. It's rough around the edges and suffers from its own budget, but when the combat clicks, I think it's still really great. But that's all I really have to say, and so that brings me to the end of the video. If you had a good time here and you enjoyed this one, I'd really appreciate your support by liking the video, leaving a comment down below, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing the video to other people that might be interested and ringing the bell also helps out a lot, and any of that support does help keep this channel afloat. So, thanks again for watching to the end of the video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.